I stood alone in my quiet kitchen, staring at the small retirement cake I had bought for myself. 67 years old, 32 years in uniform, and not a single call from my own family. No message from my son Mark. No, we're on our way. Nothing. I lit the candle anyway, just to prove the day was real. Then my phone rang. "Ma'am, this is Officer Reynolds from Chicago PD. We need you to come in." Immediately, my heart tightened. After all these years, what could possibly be so urgent tonight? If you've ever felt forgotten by the people who should remember you the most, I'd really like to hear your story. Go ahead and share where you're watching from and what time it is there. It makes this moment feel a little less lonely. And if this opening touched something in you, don't forget to like and subscribe. I have a feeling this story is going to take us somewhere neither of us expects. I have lived in the same modest brick house on the south side of Chicago for nearly 25 years. The paint on the porch railing has started to peel, and the wind always finds its way through the kitchen window no matter how many times I've sealed it. Still, it's home. It's where I raised my son, Mark Whitman, mostly on my own. People like to imagine police work as something loud and heroic. Sirens, flashing lights, dramatic rescues. But most of my 32 years in the Chicago Police Department were quieter than that. Long hours, cold nights, endless paperwork, and choices that stayed with you long after your shift ended. I never talked about those choices at home. Mark used to ask me questions when he was little. "Mom, did you catch the bad guys today?" he'd say, sitting at the kitchen table with his cereal, his hair still sticking up in every direction. I would smile, kiss his forehead, and tell him, "I just did my job, sweetheart." At some point, he stopped asking. Now Mark is 45, successful in ways I never quite understood. He runs some kind of logistics company, always talking about contracts, expansions, numbers that sounded too big to be real. He lives across town in a modern house with glass walls and polished floors that always made me nervous to walk on. His wife Lisa is efficient. That's the word I always settled on. She has a way of looking at things like they're transactions, time-effort relationships. Everything has a value and everything needs a return. I never quite knew where I fit in her calculations. And then there's Ethan, my grandson, 16 years old, tall, quiet, always with headphones around his neck. He barely looks up when I visit. I sometimes wonder if he even knows what I used to do, or if to him, I'm just his father's aging mother who shows up with store-bought cookies. Somewhere along the line, I became background noise in my own family. It didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, subtle. First, it was the missed calls. "Sorry, Mom, I've been swamped," Mark would say. Then it became shorter visits. "We can only stay an hour. We've got plans," Lisa would add. Eventually, it turned into silence that stretched longer than I was comfortable admitting. And with that silence came assumptions. I remember one afternoon, about a year ago, sitting in Mark's living room while he and Lisa discussed something in the kitchen. They weren't whispering. They didn't think I could hear. "She really should think about downsizing," Lisa said. "That house is old, and honestly, what does she even need it for?" Mark sighed. "I know. It's not like she has anything tying her there. She's not exactly, accomplished." I sat there staring at the framed photo of Mark as a boy wearing the little baseball uniform I could barely afford back then. Not accomplished. The words didn't hit me all at once. They settled slowly like dust. I didn't confront him. I didn't correct him. I simply folded my hands in my lap and waited for them to come back into the room, pretending I hadn't heard a thing. That's what I had learned to do best over the years. Stay quiet. Blend in. Disappear. I suppose part of it was my fault. I never told them about the nights I didn't come home until sunrise. I never told them about the cases that kept me awake for weeks. I never told them about the people whose lives crossed mine in ways that changed everything. To them, I was just a police officer. A job. A paycheck. A routine. Nothing extraordinary. And maybe, if I'm being honest, I let them believe that because it was easier than explaining the truth. Easier than reliving it. Easier than admitting how much I had sacrificed and how much I had missed. Like birthdays, school plays, quiet dinners that never happened. Mark grew up with a mother who was often gone even when I was physically in the room. My body might have been at the table, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Always listening, always alert, always waiting for the next call. He never said it outright, but I think he resented that. And resentment, when left unspoken, has a way of hardening into something else. Distance, judgment, indifference. By the time he became an adult, the gap between us felt permanent. We weren't fighting. We weren't arguing. We were simply not connected. And that, I've learned, can hurt even more. Tonight, standing in my empty kitchen with that small cake and a single flickering candle, all of those years seemed to press down on me at once. 32 years of service. Decades of showing up for strangers. And yet, when it came to the people I loved most, I had somehow become invisible. I thought about calling Mark again. Just one more time. Maybe he'd pick up this time. Maybe he'd say he was on his way. Maybe he'd remembered after all. But I didn't. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. Instead, I picked up my phone not to call him, but to silence it. And that's when it rang. An unfamiliar number. Chicago PD. I stared at the screen for a moment, my heart doing that old familiar thing it used to do before every shift. That quiet tightening in my chest. That instinct that something was about to change. I answered. Daisy Whitman speaking. The voice on the other end was steady, professional. Ma'am, this is Officer Reynolds. We need you to come down to the station immediately. Immediately. Not tomorrow. Not when it's convenient. Now. My first thought wasn't about myself. It never is. Is something wrong? I asked. Is someone hurt? There was a brief pause. Ma'am, it's important. That's all I can say over the phone. That was enough. Old habits don't fade, they wait. I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair, the same one I've worn for years, and slipped it on without thinking. For a moment, I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window. Gray hair pulled back. Lines around my eyes. A woman who looked exactly like what my son believed her to be. Ordinary. I turned off the light, leaving the untouched cake behind the candle still burning low. And as I stepped out into the cold Chicago night, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting for me at that station, it had nothing to do with the woman my family thought they knew. I didn't always expect to spend important days alone. There was a time when I believed, maybe foolishly, that certain moments would always bring people together. Birthdays, holidays, and especially something like this retirement. 32 years in one profession. That had to mean something, didn't it? A week before that night, I had stood in this same kitchen with a notepad in my hand, making a list like I used to when Mark was still young. Simple things: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic. Ethan liked those, or at least he used to. I even considered baking a pie from scratch, but my hands aren't as steady as they once were, so I settled for buying one from the bakery down the street. I remember smiling to myself as I wrote it all down. It had been a long time since I planned something for all of us. I picked up the phone that afternoon and called Mark first. He answered on the third ring, distracted as usual. Hey, Mom, can I call you back? I'm in the middle of something. It'll just take a minute, I said, gently. I was wondering if you, Lisa, and Ethan could come over next Friday evening. I thought we could have dinner together. There was a pause. Not a long one, just enough for me to recognize what it meant. Friday, he said. I think I've got a meeting that night. It might run late. Oh, I replied, trying to keep my voice light. Well, if it ends early, you could still stop by. I won't make it too late. Yeah, maybe, he said. I'll let you know. He didn't ask why. That should have been my first sign. I called Lisa next. She picked up quickly, her tone polished and brisk. Hi, Daisy. Everything okay? Everything. Yes, dear, I said. I was just calling to see if you could come over Friday evening. I'm planning a small dinner. There was a soft clinking sound in the background like glasses or dishes. Friday. Oh, I wish I could, but I have a charity event that night. It's been on my calendar for weeks. Of course, I said. That sounds important. It is, she replied. Maybe we can do something another time. Another time. I thanked her and hung up before she could hear the silence on my end. Ethan was the last one I tried. He didn't answer at first, but he called back later that evening. Hey, Grandma, he said, his voice half distracted by whatever he was watching or listening to. Hi, sweetheart, I said. I was hoping you could come over Friday night. I'm making dinner. There was a brief pause, then, I think I'm going out with friends. We've been planning it. I see, I said. Well, maybe next time. Yeah, he replied quickly. Next time. And that was that. 3 calls, 3 polite rejections. No questions. No curiosity. Not one of them asked why I wanted them there. I remember standing by the window after that last call, looking out at the street as cars passed by their headlights stretching across the pavement. For a moment, I considered telling them, just saying it out loud. It's my retirement. But the words stayed where they always had inside me. Because if I had to tell them, if I had to remind them, then what would that really mean? I told myself it didn't matter, that I was being sensitive, that people had busy lives. But deep down, something had already shifted. Still, I went ahead with the plan. That Friday, I woke up earlier than usual. Old habits again. Even without a shift to report to my body, still believed in schedules. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, even places no one ever looked at anymore. The corners behind furniture, the shelves in the hallway, the little things that used to matter when company was expected. I set the table around 4 in the afternoon. 3 extra plates, 3 sets of silverware, cloth napkins I hadn't used in years. I even took out the good glasses, the ones Mark once said made him feel like we were celebrating something special. As I moved around the kitchen preparing the meal, I found myself slipping into memories without meaning to. Mark, at 8 years old, sitting at this same table swinging his legs under the chair because they didn't quite reach the floor. Mom, are you going to be home tonight? He had asked, once his eyes searching mine. I'll try, I had told him. I always said I'd try. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Back then I told myself it was for his future, for stability, for safety, for something bigger than the moment. But children don't understand bigger than the moment. Back then I told myself it was for his future, for stability, for safety, for something bigger than the moment. But children don't understand bigger than the moment. They understand presence, or the lack of it. By 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The food was warm, the table was set, the house was quiet. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. At 6:30, I told myself they were just running late. At 7, I reheated the food. At 7:30, I turned off the oven. By 8, I knew. Not because of anything they said, but because of what they didn't. I sat down at the table looking at the empty chairs across from me. For a moment, I imagined them filled. Mark leaning back slightly talking about work. Lisa nodding politely, occasionally checking her phone. Ethan barely looking up but still there. Even that would have been enough. But the chairs stayed empty. Eventually I stood up and began clearing the table. One plate at a time, one quiet movement after another. I wrapped the food in containers I knew I wouldn't finish. I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than necessary. When I was done, the kitchen looked exactly the way it had that morning, untouched, as if none of it had ever happened. That's when I went out and bought the cake. A small one. Nothing fancy. Just something to mark the day. Because if I didn't, who would? And now, standing in that same kitchen with the candle burning low, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. It wasn't just that they had forgotten. It was that they had never thought to remember. The difference between those two things is heavier than most people realize. I picked up my coat shortly after that. Not because I expected the night to change, but because something in that phone call felt different, urgent, unavoidable. As I stepped out into the cold, I locked the door behind me out of habit, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet street. I didn't know where the night was taking me, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something stir inside me that I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not disappointment, something sharper, something closer to anticipation, and I couldn't explain why. The streets of Chicago felt different at night when you were part of the force. Most people see darkness as something to avoid. To us, it was where everything revealed itself. I hadn't thought about that in a long time. Not until I got behind the wheel that night heading toward the station. My hands rested on the steering wheel with a familiarity that surprised me. Even after all these years, my body remembered what it meant to respond to a call. The quiet focus, the alertness, the way every streetlight, every passing car, every shadow seemed to matter. And just like that, without warning, my mind drifted back. Back to one of the nights I never told Mark about. It had been late fall, nearly 20 years ago. The air had that same bite it carried, now sharp enough to keep you awake. I was working a night shift when the call came. Impossible child abduction, residential neighborhood, no suspect identified. Those calls are different. You feel them in your chest before you even reach the scene. When I arrived, there were already patrol cars lining the street, red and blue lights flashing against the houses. A woman stood on the front lawn, screaming into the night. Her voice breaking in a way I'll never forget. "My son, please. Someone find my son." I remember stepping out of the car and walking toward her, forcing myself to stay calm. That's part of the job. You become the still point in someone else's chaos. "What's his name?" I asked gently. "Daniel," she cried. "He's 8 years old. He was just in his room." Her words dissolved into sobs. Inside the house, everything looked normal. Too normal. A bed neatly made, a window slightly open. No signs of struggle. No noise. No witnesses. That kind of silence is the worst kind. We canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions no one could answer. Time moved differently that night. Every minute felt like it mattered more than the last. I remember standing in that boy's bedroom, looking at the small details. A toy car on the floor. A drawing taped to the wall. A half-finished homework assignment on the desk. Ordinary things. That's what made it unbearable. Because somewhere out there, something very far from ordinary was happening. Most officers stayed focused on the immediate area, but something about that open window kept pulling at me. It wasn't forced, it wasn't broken, it was deliberate. I stepped outside and followed the narrow strip of grass along the side of the house. The ground was soft from earlier rain, and after a few feet, I saw it. Footprints, faint, but there, leading away from the house. I called it in and started following the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It led toward a line of trees behind the neighborhood, a place most people wouldn't think to look unless they had a reason, or unless they were trying not to be seen. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the street faded until all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I heard something else. A muffled sound. A cry. I froze, listening carefully. It came again, soft, frightened, unmistakable. Help! My heart kicked harder, but my training held me steady. I moved forward slowly, scanning the area, every sense sharpened. And then I saw it. A small figure tied to a tree, partially hidden in the shadows. Daniel. His eyes widened when he saw me, tears streaking down his face. "It's okay," I whispered, kneeling beside him. "You're safe now." But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Because just as I reached for the rope, I heard movement behind me. Footsteps. Fast. I turned just in time to see a man rushing toward us, his face twisted with panic and anger. He hadn't expected to be found. Not this quickly. There's a split second in moments like that where everything becomes clear. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight. I stepped between him and the boy, my voice firm. "Stop right there." He didn't. What happened next unfolded in fragments, movement shouting the sound of something hitting the ground. I remember the weight of the struggle, the urgency of it, the knowledge that I couldn't afford to lose control. Not here. Not now. When it was over, he was on the ground restrained, and backup was already on the way. But I didn't wait. I turned back to Daniel, my hands working quickly to free him. His small body trembled as I pulled him close, wrapping my coat around his shoulders. "You're okay," I told him softly. "You're going home." He clung to me, his fingers gripping the fabric like he was afraid I might disappear. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the paperwork, not the reports, not the long hours that would follow. Just that one life safe again. I walked him out of those trees and back toward the flashing lights, back toward his mother, who collapsed to her knees the moment she saw him. "Daniel," she cried, pulling him into her arms. I stepped back, giving them space, watching from a distance as relief washed over that entire scene. No cameras, no applause, just quiet, overwhelming gratitude. That was the night I understood something I never tried to explain to anyone else. Some things you do not for recognition, not for credit, but because if you don't, no one else will. I never told Mark about that night, not when he was a child, not when he became an adult, not even when he started to believe that my life had been ordinary. Because how do you explain something like that to someone who wasn't there? How do you make them feel what you felt in that moment? You don't. You carry it with you. Silently. The memory faded as I pulled into the parking lot of the station. The building looked the same as station. The building looked the same as it always had. Solid. Familiar. A place that had once defined every part of my life. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands still on the wheel. That night that boy it always had. Solid, familiar. A place that had once defined every part of my life. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands still on the wheel. That night, that boy, I hadn't thought about him in years. I wondered briefly what had become of him, whether he remembered, whether it had mattered. Then I shook the thought away. It didn't matter. That's what I had always told myself. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting my face, and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The front desk officer looked up as I approached, his expression shifting the moment he recognized me. "Ma'am," he said, standing a little straighter. "They've been expecting you." Expecting me. The words felt strange. I nodded, unsure what else to say. Another officer appeared from the hallway, gesturing for me to follow. "This way, Ms. Whitman." His tone was respectful, almost careful. As we walked down the corridor, I noticed something else. People were watching. Not casually, not in passing. They were looking at me with something I hadn't seen directed my way in a very long time. Recognition, respect, and something else I couldn't quite place. We reached a set of double doors at the end of the hall. The officer paused, placing his hand on the handle. "They're ready for you," he said. I frowned slightly. "Who is?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door, and as I stepped forward, I realized whatever was waiting for me on the other side, it wasn't an emergency. It was something far more unexpected. The doors didn't open into chaos. They opened into silence. That was the first thing that struck me. After all those years of responding to calls, of walking into rooms filled with urgency noise, panic, I had expected something familiar, something I knew how to handle. Instead, I stepped into a wide hallway that felt almost still. Too still. The officer who had led me there didn't follow. I heard the door close quietly behind me, leaving me alone in the space ahead. For a moment, I just stood there, my eyes adjusting to the softer lighting, my ears searching for any sign of what was waiting. Nothing. Just the faint hum of electricity and the distant echo of movement somewhere far away. "This doesn't feel right," I murmured under my breath. And yet, I kept walking. Old instincts again. When something doesn't make sense, you move toward it, not away. The hallway stretched longer than I remembered, lined with framed photographs and commendations. Faces I recognized, names I had worked alongside for years. Some retired, some gone. I slowed as I passed them, my gaze lingering longer than I expected. There was Officer Jenkins, who used to bring donuts every Friday morning. Sergeant Alvarez, who once stayed with me through an entire overnight shift because I refused to leave a witness alone. And then there was a photo of me. I almost didn't recognize it at first. Younger. Hair darker. Eyes sharper. Standing in uniform with a group of officers after what must have been some operation I barely remembered anymore. I stopped, tilted my head slightly. "When was that taken?" I whispered. No answer came, because of course it didn't. I exhaled slowly and kept moving. The hallway turned slightly to the right, opening into another corridor. This one was different. The walls were cleaner, the lighting brighter. And at the far end, I could see something. Light. Not the harsh fluorescent kind. Something warmer. And there were sounds now. Muffled. Like voices, but controlled. Contained. My steps slowed. Every instinct I had built over decades was telling me that I was walking into something prepared. Something deliberate. And for the first time since I got that call, I felt uncertain. Not afraid, but exposed. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped just short of another set of doors. These ones were larger, closed, and unlike before, there was no one there to open them for me. I stood there for a moment staring at the handle, my reflection faintly visible in the polished metal. Gray hair, tired eyes. A woman who had just been sitting alone in her kitchen less than an hour ago, wondering if her life had meant anything at all. I almost laughed. "Whatever this is," I said quietly, "it better be worth leaving that cake behind." My hand reached out before I could second-guess myself. I pushed the door open and immediately stepped back. Light flooded toward me. Bright, warm, overwhelming. For a split second, I couldn't see anything at all. My eyes struggled to adjust, blinking rapidly as shapes began to form out of the brightness. Rows of chairs, a stage, people, a lot of people. My breath caught in my throat. What is this? No one answered right away, but I could feel it. Every eye in that room was on me. Not casually, not accidentally, deliberately. The kind of attention you can't ignore no matter how hard you try. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. The room came into focus slowly. Uniforms, badges, faces I recognized, and many I didn't. Officers of all ranks, some standing, some seated, all watching. And then, as if on cue, someone near the front straightened, adjusting a microphone. A voice carried across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, she's here." A ripple moved through the crowd. Not loud, not chaotic, just a subtle shift, like a wave passing through still water. My heart began to beat faster. "This has to be a mistake," I said under my breath. I looked around, half expecting someone to step forward and correct it, to say they had called the wrong person, that I wasn't supposed to be here, but no one moved to stop me. Instead, an officer I didn't recognize approached from the side, his posture formal but his expression something else, respectful, almost reverent. "Ms. Whitman," he said, his voice steady, "if you would please come this way." He gestured toward the front. "Toward the stage?" I hesitated. "I think you've got the wrong—" "We don't," he interrupted gently. Not sharply, not rudely, just certain. Something in his tone made it impossible to argue. So I followed. Each step felt heavier than the last, my mind racing through possibilities that didn't quite make sense. A meeting, a briefing, no. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. As I moved down the aisle, I could feel the weight of every gaze, every quiet breath, every unspoken expectation pressing in on me. I wasn't used to this. I had spent my entire career avoiding attention, deflecting praise, stepping back when others stepped forward. And now there was nowhere to step. The officer led me to the front row and paused. "Please," he said. I looked at the empty seat, then back at him. "What is this about?" I asked, my voice lower now, more cautious. He gave a small smile. "You'll see." I didn't like that answer. Not after everything I had learned to expect from this job. But something told me that walking away wasn't an option anymore. So I sat down. The chair felt too firm, too real, grounding me in a moment that still didn't feel entirely real. The room quieted further, if that was even possible. And then the man at the microphone cleared his throat. He looked out over the audience, then down at something in his hands. Notes, prepared words. This evening, he began, his voice calm, but carrying easily through the room. We gather to honor someone who has spent a lifetime serving this city, often without recognition, and always without expectation. My chest tightened. "No, this couldn't be someone," he continued, "whose actions have shaped lives, protected families, and upheld the very values this department stands for." I felt my hands grip the edge of the chair. A strange sensation spread through me. Not quite fear, not quite disbelief, Something deeper. Something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. Hope. But hope is dangerous when you've spent years learning not to expect anything. So I shook my head slightly, almost instinctively rejecting the idea forming in my mind. "This isn't about me," I whispered. "It couldn't be. It didn't make sense. Not after everything. Not after being forgotten so completely, so easily by the people who were supposed to know me best." The man at the microphone looked up, and for the briefest moment our eyes met. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no uncertainty, only clarity, only intention. And then he spoke again. "And tonight," he said, "we finally have the opportunity to say something long overdue." The room held its breath, including me. The silence that followed those words felt heavier than anything I had carried in years. And tonight, the man at the microphone repeated, his voice steady. "We finally have the opportunity to say something long overdue." I sat frozen in my chair, my fingers still curled around the edge, as if letting go might somehow make this moment disappear. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had spent decades making sure moments like this never happened to me. Recognition meant attention. Attention meant questions. And questions led to memories I had carefully locked away. But the room didn't shift. The people didn't disappear. And the man on the stage didn't correct himself. Instead, he turned, slightly gesturing toward a large screen behind him. "Before we begin," he said, "there are some stories that need to be told." The lights dimmed. A soft murmur moved through the room as the screen flickered to life. My chest tightened. "No," I whispered, barely audible even to myself. The first image appeared, a photograph, grainy, old, taken long before everything became digital. I leaned forward slightly, my breath catching as I recognized it. It was from my early years on the force. A night scene, police tape stretched across a narrow street. And there, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was me, younger, focused, standing just outside the spotlight. I felt something shift deep inside me. That's just a routine call," I muttered under my breath. But the man's voice cut gently through the darkness. "Officer Daisy Whitman," he said, "was never one to seek attention. In fact, many of the most important things she did were never formally recognized." The next image appeared, a hospital hallway. I remembered that one immediately. A witness protection case. A young woman who had refused to testify until someone promised she wouldn't be alone. I had stayed with her for 16 hours straight. I hadn't told anyone that part, not even my supervisor. "Multiple cases," the man continued, "where Officer Whitman chose to stay beyond her assigned duty, not because she was required to, but because she believed no one should face fear alone." My throat tightened. "They're exaggerating," I whispered, shaking my head slightly. But even as I said it, I knew they weren't. They were just saying it out loud. The next image came faster. A burned-out building, smoke still rising into the air. I felt my hands tense. That night. I had almost forgotten that night. During a residential fire, the voice went on while others secured the perimeter. Officer Whitman entered the structure after reports of a missing occupant. I closed my eyes briefly. "That wasn't protocol," I murmured. "No, it wasn't, but I hadn't been able to walk away." "She located and evacuated a civilian," he continued. "Without waiting for clearance." A ripple moved through the audience. Soft, respectful, but enough to make my chest feel too tight. I opened my eyes again, staring at the screen. That was one time I said quietly, "Just one." But it wasn't, and deep down I knew that too. The images kept coming. snapshots of moments I had never thought anyone noticed. A street corner at dawn, a patrol car parked outside a school, a quiet exchange between me and someone I couldn't even remember anymore. Each one a fragment, each one a piece of a life I had never tried to explain. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. How did they have these who had been paying attention? The man on stage paused, letting the images fade into darkness. Then he looked back out at the audience, and perhaps the most defining moment he said, my heart skipped. "No, not that." The screen lit up again, and this time I didn't need to see it clearly to know what it was. Trees, darkness, a flashlight beam cutting through the night. My breath stopped. "That case," I said under my breath. "That was sealed. It was supposed to be confidential, protected." But the image was there. And then another, a small figure, a child. Daniel. I felt something break open inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like a door I had kept closed for too long. "Nearly 2 decades ago," the man said, his voice softer now, more deliberate. Officer Whitman responded to a child abduction case that had no immediate leads. The room was completely silent. No movement, no shifting, just listening. She followed evidence others overlooked. He continued, alone, into an area considered too risky to approach without backup. I shook my head slightly. "That's not how it happened," I whispered, but my voice carried no conviction. "Because it was exactly how it happened. She located the child," he said, and intervened before further harm could occur. My hands began to tremble. I pressed them together, trying to steady them. "She made a decision in that moment," he added, "that went beyond procedure." I exhaled slowly. That's one way to put it. A faint sound escaped me. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. The man paused again, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room. Then he looked down at his notes and closed them, which meant whatever came next wasn't written. "This isn't just about what's documented," he said, lifting his gaze again. "It's about what isn't. The choices made when no one was watching. The sacrifices made when no one was counting." I felt something rise in my chest, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite separate. Pride, regret, loss. And for years, he continued, those choices went unrecognized outside of those directly affected. I swallowed hard, because that part was true. No headlines, no ceremonies, just moments that passed and were gone. "That's enough," I whispered quietly. "You don't have to." But he continued, "Until now." The lights in the room slowly began to brighten again. The screen faded to black. And for a moment, there was nothing. No images, no words, just silence. Then from somewhere in the audience, a single pair of hands began to clap. Softly, deliberately. I turned my head slightly, trying to see who it was. Then another joined, and another, and another. The sound grew, filling the room in a way that felt almost unreal. Applause. For me. I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur slightly as I tried to process what was happening. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, this isn't." But the applause didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger, more certain, more unified. And suddenly, I didn't know what to do. I had faced armed suspects, walked into burning buildings, handled situations that most people would run from without a second thought. But this moment left me completely unprepared because I had never learned how to stand in the middle of recognition. I had only ever learned how to stand in the shadows. And yet, here I was, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. Every person in that room was on their feet now, clapping, watching, waiting. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Not doubt, not distance, but something else entirely. Something I didn't quite have a name for yet, and just as I began to understand it. The man on stage stepped forward again, lifting his hand slightly. The applause slowly faded. The room settled. And then he said the words that would change everything. "Officer Daisy Whitman," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Would you please join us on stage?" My heart stopped. For a second, I didn't move, because if I did, this would all become real. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air, echoing in my chest, louder than the applause had just moments before. "Officer Daisy Whitman, would you please join us on stage?" No one spoke. No one moved, except they were all looking at me, waiting, expecting. I felt my fingers loosen slightly from the edge of the chair, though I hadn't even realized how tightly I had been gripping it. My body didn't seem to belong to me anymore. It was as if I were watching myself from a distance, unsure of what would happen next. "No," I whispered under my breath. "There's no reason for me to be up there." But there was. Everyone in that room seemed to know it. Everyone except me. The man on stage didn't rush me. He didn't repeat himself. He simply stood there patient, certain that I would move when I was ready. That certainty unsettled me more than anything else. Because for decades, I had defined myself by staying in the background, by stepping aside, by letting others take the credit, the spotlight, the recognition. That had been my role, my place. And now that place was gone. I swallowed hard and slowly pushed myself to my feet. The movement felt heavier than it should have, as if standing up meant more than just rising from a chair. It meant stepping into something I had avoided my entire life. The room remained silent as I turned toward the aisle. I could feel my pulse in my ears, each step forward measured, deliberate, uncertain. I kept my eyes low at first, focused on the path ahead of me, the polished floor, the faint reflection of the lights above. But eventually, I looked up, and what I saw made me pause. They weren't just watching, they were standing. Every single person in that room was on their feet again, not clapping this time, just standing, as if acknowledging something deeper than applause could express. Respect. The kind you don't ask for, the kind you don't expect, the kind that builds quietly over time until it can't be ignored anymore. My chest tightened. "I don't deserve this," I murmured softly. But even as the words left my mouth, something inside me questioned them. Or maybe I had simply never allowed myself to consider that I might. I reached the steps leading up to the stage and hesitated. Just for a second. Because once I stepped up there would be no going back to the quiet, invisible version of myself I had been living as for so long. The officer standing nearby gave a small nod. Encouraging, not forcing, just there. So I took the step, then another, and suddenly I was standing on the stage. The lights were brighter up here, warmer. They made everything feel more exposed, more real. I turned slowly, facing the audience. It was overwhelming, rows upon rows of faces, some familiar, many not, all focused on me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know where to look. The man who had been speaking stepped closer, offering a gentle smile. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Whitman." he said. I let out a quiet breath. I didn't know I had a choice, I replied, my voice softer than I expected. A few people in the audience smiled faintly at that. He nodded, understanding more than I had said. That's fair, he said. But I think you'll understand why we asked. I wasn't so sure. Not yet. He turned slightly, addressing the audience again. For those of you who have worked alongside Officer Whitman, he said you already know what kind of person she is. A few heads nodded. Subtle, but real. And for those who haven't, he continued, tonight is about making sure you do. I shifted slightly, unsure of where to place my hands, my attention myself. This wasn't my world. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. He reached down to the podium and picked up something small. At first, I couldn't see it clearly. Then he turned back toward me. And I did. A badge. Not the one I had turned in. This one was different. Framed. Polished. Carefully preserved. My breath caught. I started, then stopped. I hadn't seen it since the day I retired. Since the moment I placed it on that desk and walked away. Your badge, he said gently. 32 years of service. I nodded slowly. I know what it is, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. Not in the way it once had. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to decide how much to say next. Then he spoke again. Do you remember the cases? He asked. I frowned slightly. Some of them, I said carefully. More than you think, he replied. I looked at him, something shifting again in my chest. Why does that matter? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, looking out toward the audience. Because he said, his voice carrying again, those cases, those moments didn't end when you walked away from them. I felt my brow tighten. What do you mean? He turned back to me. It means, he said, the people whose lives you touched, they didn't forget. The words hit differently than everything else that had been said so far. Not louder, not more dramatic, but deeper, more personal. They didn't forget, I repeated quietly. He shook his head. No, Ms. Whitman, they didn't. A strange feeling moved through me. Something unfamiliar. Something that didn't fit with the quiet loneliness I had carried into this building just an hour ago. But my family did, I said, before I could stop myself. The words slipped out. Unplanned, unfiltered. And for a moment, the room shifted again. Not uncomfortably, but honestly. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look uncomfortable. He just nodded. Yes, he said softly. They did. There was no judgment in his voice, no attempt to correct me, just acknowledgement. And that's why tonight matters, he added. I stared at him, trying to understand. Why? I asked. He took a breath, and then he said something that made everything else pause. Because sometimes, he said, the people closest to us don't see the full picture. My chest tightened again. And sometimes, he continued, it takes someone else, someone whose life was changed by what you did. Because sometimes, he said, the people closest to us don't see the full picture. My chest tightened again. And sometimes, he continued, it takes someone else, someone whose life was changed by what you did, to remind them who you really are. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because in that moment, something told me this wasn't over. Not even close. There was still something waiting. Something bigger than the stories, the applause, the recognition. And I could feel it. Just beneath the surface. Getting closer, I stood there on that stage, the lights warm against my face, the room impossibly still, and his words echoing in my mind. The people whose lives you touched, they didn't forget. I didn't know what to do with that. Because for years I had convinced myself that those moments had simply passed. That they mattered only in the instant they happened, and then faded into memory mine and no one else's. But now something was telling me I had been wrong. The man stepped slightly to the side, glancing toward the edge of the stage. "Tonight," he said, "we wanted to do more than just tell these stories." My heart tightened again. "What are you doing?" I whispered under my breath. He didn't answer me directly. Instead, he looked toward someone off stage and gave a small nod. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from behind me. I turned instinctively, and that's when I saw him. At first, I didn't recognize him. A man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, tall, composed, dressed neatly though not in uniform. There was something steady in the way he walked, something grounded. But it wasn't his appearance that made my breath catch. It was his eyes. There was something familiar there. Something I couldn't place, but couldn't ignore. He stepped forward, stopping a few feet away from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The room seemed to lean in closer, every person holding their breath. Then he smiled, softly. Not like someone meeting a stranger. Like someone seeing something long remembered. "Hello, Officer Whitman," he said. The sound of that title, after all this time, did something to me I wasn't prepared for. I swallowed. "Hello," I replied carefully. "I'm sorry, have we met?" He let out a small breath, almost like he had expected that. "Not like this," he said. I frowned slightly. "I don't understand." He took a step closer, not too close, just enough that I could see his face more clearly now. "I think you might remember a night," he said gently, "a long time ago. Cold, quiet. A neighborhood with trees behind it." My heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. "There was a boy." He continued, his voice softer now. 8 years old. Scared. Tied to a tree. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to steady myself. "Daniel," I whispered. His smile deepened, though there was something emotional behind it now. "Yes," he said. "Daniel." The room seemed to disappear around us. All I could see was him. All I could hear was the memory rushing back stronger than it had been in years. "You." I started, my voice catching. "You're him," he said simply. Silence. Complete. Overwhelming. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, searching his face, trying to connect the frightened child I had pulled from the darkness with the man standing in front of me now. "You're alive," I said, barely above a whisper. It was a strange thing to say, but it was the only thing that came out. He nodded. "I am," he replied, "because of you." My throat tightened. "No," I said, quickly shaking my head. "No, that's not. There were other officers. There was a whole—" "There was you," he interrupted gently, not forcefully, not dismissively, just certain. "You came into those woods," he said. "You found me. You stayed with me. You didn't leave." The memory flooded in sharper now, his small hands gripping my coat, his voice trembling. the way he had looked at me like I was the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. "I was just doing my job," I said softly. He shook his head. "That's what you tell yourself," he replied. But that's not what it felt like to me. I didn't know how to respond to that, because the truth was, I had never asked, never wondered what it felt like on the other side of that moment. I had only carried my version of it. He took another small step closer. "I don't remember everything from that night," he admitted, "but I remember you." My chest tightened again. "I remember your voice," he continued. "I remember the way you said I was safe. I remember holding onto your coat like it was the only thing that mattered." I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered that too, more clearly now than I had in years. "And I remember something else," he added. I opened my eyes again. "What?" He hesitated for just a second. As they were taking me away, he said, "I asked someone your name." My breath caught. I needed to know, he continued, because I didn't want to forget who saved me. The room felt too small suddenly, too full, and I didn't, he said. Not once. I shook my head slowly, overwhelmed. "You couldn't have, it was so long ago." He smiled again, but this time there was something stronger behind it. "Some things don't fade," he said. I felt something shift deep inside me, something I had buried for a long time. "Daniel." I said his name, feeling different now. Real. Present. "My name is Daniel Reynolds now," he said. I took my adoptive parents' last name, Reynolds. My mind caught up suddenly. The phone call. "Officer Reynolds?" I whispered. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." I stared at him, the pieces falling into place one by one. "You were the one who called me." "I was," he confirmed. My heart pounded. You brought me here." He glanced around the room briefly, then back at me. "Not just me," he said. "But yes, I made sure you got that call." I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. Why, I asked. The question felt bigger than it sounded. Why now? Why this? Why me? His expression softened. "Because tonight," he said, "was supposed to be your retirement." I swallowed. "Yes. And you were alone," he added. The words landed gently but deeply. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He already knew. "I couldn't let that happen," he said quietly. Something in my chest cracked open. Not painfully, but undeniably. "So you did all this?" I asked, gesturing faintly to the room, the people, the stage. He shook his head slightly. "I started it," he said, "but I'm not the only one." He stepped aside just enough for me to see past him, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't fully processed before. There were others, standing along the side of the stage, waiting, watching, people I didn't recognize, but who were looking at me the same way Daniel was, like they knew me, like I mattered. My breath caught again. "Who are they?" I asked. Daniel's voice was steady. "They're the rest of the story," he said. I turned back to him slowly. "The part you never saw." And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. My life hadn't been invisible. I had just never been looking in the right direction. I couldn't move. Not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me had gone completely still. "They're the rest of the story." Daniel's words lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before. I slowly turned my head toward the side of the stage again. There were at least 6 people standing there, different ages, different backgrounds, different lives, and yet they were all looking at me the same way. Not like strangers, not like observers, but like people who had been waiting for this moment. My chest tightened. I don't know them, I said quietly. Daniel nodded. I know, he replied. That's the point. I swallowed. What do you mean? He stepped slightly to the side, giving me a clearer view. Go ahead, he said gently. You should hear it from them. Before I could respond, one of the people stepped forward. A woman, mid-40s maybe, dark hair pulled back neatly. Professional, composed, but her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, like she was holding something in. She walked toward me slowly, stopping just a few feet away. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at me, and there was something in her eyes, something familiar. Not in the way Daniel had been, but in a way that made my memories stir. Ms. Whitman, she said softly. I nodded. Yes. She let out a small breath like she had been holding it for a long time. I didn't know if you would recognize me, she admitted. I studied her face carefully, tried to find something, anything. I'm sorry, I said honestly. I don't think... It was the hospital, she said quickly. A long time ago. I was a witness in a case. My mind shifted. Hospital, witness, fear. And then... You wouldn't leave, she continued. They told me I had to testify the next morning, but I refused. I was terrified. I blinked, and suddenly I saw it. A young woman, pale, shaking, sitting in a hospital bed, clutching the blanket like it was the only thing holding her together. You stayed with me, she said, her voice softer now, the entire night. I felt my breath catch. That was, I started. 16 hours, she said. Without a break. I looked at her more closely now. The fear I remembered wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced by something stronger, something steady. You told me I wasn't alone, she said, and for the first time, I believed it. The memory came back fully then, not just the scene, the feeling, the quiet determination I had carried through that night. You testified, I said slowly. She smiled. I did, she replied. Because of you. My chest tightened again. I didn't do anything special, I said instinctively. She shook her head. You did everything, she corrected gently. I didn't know how to answer that. Before I could try, another person stepped forward. A man, this time. Older than the first woman. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. He walked with a slight stiffness, but his posture was straight, his gaze unwavering. Officer Whitman, he said. I nodded again. Yes. You probably don't remember me, he said. I hesitated. I'm starting to think I should, I replied. A faint smile crossed his face. There was a fire, he said. My stomach dropped. No, that building, he continued. I was inside. I stared at him. The burned-out structure, the smoke, the decision I had made without waiting for orders. You were the one, I whispered. He nodded. I was trapped, he said. Collapsed beam. Couldn't move. Could barely breathe. I felt the memory hit harder this time, because I remembered the risk. The heat. The moment I almost turned back. You came in anyway, he said. They told you to wait. I closed my eyes briefly. I shouldn't have gone in, I murmured. He shook his head. If you hadn't, he said firmly, I wouldn't be standing here. I opened my eyes again. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't dramatizing. He was stating a fact. My daughter got married last year, he added. I walked her down the aisle. My throat tightened. I have 2 grandchildren now, he continued. They know my name because you made sure I lived long enough to hear it. I felt something shift inside me again. Deeper this time. More undeniable. I didn't know, I said quietly. I know, he replied. That's why we're here. He stepped back. Another person moved forward, then another. Each one with a story. Each one with a moment I had carried but never fully understood from their side. A young man who had been pulled from a street corner before making a decision that would have changed his life forever. A woman who had been given a second chance because someone believed her when no one else did. A father who had been reunited with his family because someone refused to close a case too early. Each story layered over the next, each memory unfolding in a way I had never seen before. And with every word, something inside me broke open just a little more. Not painfully, but truthfully, because for years I had measured my life by what I thought I had lost. The time with Mark, the distance that had grown between us, the quiet dinners, the missed moments, the feeling of being forgotten. But standing there surrounded by people whose lives had continued because of choices I had made, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see. I hadn't been invisible. I had been present in places that mattered more than I understood. I hadn't been forgotten. I had just been remembered somewhere else. By someone else, in ways that didn't come back to me until now. I looked at Daniel again, at the others, at the room full of people who had been watching this unfold in complete silence. My voice felt different when I finally spoke, softer, but stronger. I didn't know, I said. Daniel stepped closer again. I know, he replied. And my family? I started, then stopped. The thought felt incomplete, unfinished. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. They didn't see any of this, I said finally. He nodded. No, he said, and they forgot. I added, my voice barely above a whisper now. Yes, he said again. There was no judgment, no attempt to soften it, just truth. I took a slow breath, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel the weight of that truth the same way, because something else had taken its place, something steadier, something clearer. Maybe I said slowly, they just never knew where to look. Daniel's expression softened. Maybe he agreed. The room remained silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt. Maybe, I said slowly, they just never knew where to look. Daniel's expression softened. Maybe he agreed. The room remained silent, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt full, alive, and just as I began to steady myself in that feeling, I noticed movement near the back of the room. Subtle, but enough to catch my attention. I turned slightly, and that's when I saw them. Mark, Lisa, and Ethan, standing in the doorway, watching everything. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The stage, the lights, the people behind me, all of it faded into the background as my eyes locked onto the doorway. Mark stood there frozen in place. Lisa beside him, her expression unreadable, her usual confidence replaced by something far more uncertain. And Ethan, my grandson, standing slightly behind them, his small hand gripping the edge of his father's jacket. They weren't moving. They were just watching. Watching me. Watching everything. My chest tightened so suddenly, it felt like I had forgotten how to breathe. "They're here," I whispered. Daniel followed my gaze and nodded quietly. "Yes," he said. "You knew," I asked, my voice barely steady. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. I hoped he replied. That answer told me everything. I turned back toward the doorway, my heart pounding harder with each passing second. Mark's face, I had seen it angry, dismissive, distracted, but I had never seen it like this. There was no certainty in his expression, no judgment, no impatience, just shock. And something else, something that looked dangerously close to regret. Lisa shifted slightly beside him, her arms no longer crossed the way they had been earlier that day. Instead, they hung loosely at her sides, as if she didn't know what to do with them. Ethan wasn't looking at me the way the others were. He was looking at me the way a child looks at something new, something unexpected, something important. My throat tightened. They weren't supposed to come. They weren't supposed to come, I said quietly. Daniel glanced at me again. Sometimes, he said softly, people show up when they finally understand what they're about to lose. The words hit deeper than I expected, because part of me had believed. I said quietly. Daniel glanced at me again. Sometimes, he said softly, people show up when they finally understand what they're about to lose. The words hit deeper than I expected, because part of me had truly believed that they wouldn't come. Not for dinner, not for my retirement, not for anything. And yet, here they were. But not because of me, because of this, because of what they were seeing now. And that realization, it hurt. Not sharply, not angrily, but in a quiet, undeniable way. I turned back toward the audience, trying to steady myself. But I could still feel their presence behind me, still feel their eyes, still feel the shift that had just taken place. The man on stage seemed to understand the weight of the moment. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. He simply let it exist. Then after a few seconds, he spoke again. "Officer Whitman," he said gently, "there's one more thing." I exhaled slowly. "Of course there is," I murmured. A faint ripple of soft laughter moved through the room. Not mocking, not uncomfortable, just human. He stepped closer, holding the framed badge again. "This department," he said, "has a long history of honoring those who serve with distinction." I nodded slightly. "I know," I replied. "But sometimes," he continued, "those honors come too late, or not at all." I looked at the badge in his hands. I didn't need. "This isn't about need," he said quietly. I stopped, because there was something in his voice that made it impossible to finish that sentence. "This is about truth," he added. The words settled between us. Truth. Not recognition, not ceremony. Truth. He turned, slightly addressing the room again. "Tonight," he said, "we correct that." My heart began to pound again. I didn't know what he meant, but I could feel it. Something final. Something important. After reviewing decades of service records, he continued, and testimonies from officers, civilians, and individuals directly impacted, I felt my breath shorten. The department has made a decision. I shook my head slightly. This isn't necessary? I whispered. But no one stopped. No one corrected him. Because this wasn't about stopping anymore. This was about finishing something that had been left incomplete. He turned back to me, his expression steady, respectful, certain. Daisy Whitman, he said, no longer using the formal tone, but something more personal. Now, it is my honor to inform you, I felt the room hold its breath, that you are being officially recognized with the department's highest civilian commendation for extraordinary service beyond duty. The words landed slowly, piece by piece, as if my mind needed time to catch up to what my ears had just heard. Highest commendation, I repeated quietly. He nodded. For actions that saved lives, protected the vulnerable, and upheld the integrity of this department in ways that went undocumented for far too long. My hands trembled slightly. I started, then stopped, because for once I didn't know how to dismiss it, didn't know how to step away from it, didn't know how to pretend it didn't belong to me. He extended the framed badge toward me. This belongs with you, he said. I stared at it, at the metal, at the number engraved into it, at the symbol I had once carried every single day, and then walked away from without looking back. Slowly, carefully, I reached out. My fingers brushed against the frame, and for a moment, everything came rushing back. The early mornings, the long nights, the calls that never ended, the decisions that stayed with me long after the shift was over, the quiet sacrifices, the moments no one saw, and the ones that had just been shown to me in a way I had never allowed myself to see before. My hand closed around the frame. It felt heavier than I remembered. Not physically, but emotionally. I didn't think I said softly. My voice cracked slightly. I didn't think it mattered anymore. The man shook his head. It always mattered, he said. I swallowed hard, and then without meaning to, I looked back toward the doorway again. Mark hadn't moved, but his expression had changed. The shock was still there, but now there was something else, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. Lisa's gaze had softened too, though she looked almost unsettled by it. Ethan was smiling, just a little, like he had discovered something about me that no one had ever told him before. My chest tightened again. But this time, it wasn't from pain. It was from something else entirely, something fragile, something hopeful. I turned back toward the stage, toward the room, toward the people who had carried pieces of my life forward when I thought they had been left behind. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt seen. I didn't move right away. Even though I had already turned back toward the stage, even though the badge was still in my hands, even though the entire room was watching, part of me was still standing in that doorway with them, with Mark, with Lisa, with Ethan, because no matter how much this moment meant, no matter how much had just been revealed, they were still my family. And the truth was, I didn't know what this meant for us anymore. I took a slow breath, grounding myself. Then I turned fully back to the front, back to the man standing beside me, back to the room that had just shown me a version of my life I had never truly seen before. "Thank you," I said quietly. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room was still enough that every word carried. "I don't think I've ever said that for something like this," I admitted. A few soft smiles appeared in the audience, not out of politeness, out of understanding. I spent most of my career trying not to be noticed. I continued, trying to do the work and move on to the next call. I paused, glancing briefly at the badge in my hands. And I think somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that if no one saw it, then it didn't really matter. A subtle shift moved through the room. Not disagreement, recognition. "But tonight," I said, lifting my gaze, "again you showed me something I didn't expect." My voice steadied. That it did matter. I felt my throat tighten slightly. That it mattered in ways I never thought to look for. I glanced toward Daniel for a moment, then toward the others who had stepped forward earlier. "You remembered?" I said softly. And there was something in those 2 words that felt bigger than anything else I had said all night. Because memory is what keeps things alive, and for years I had thought mine was the only one holding those moments. "I don't know how to stand up here and accept something like this," I admitted honestly. "I'm not good at it." A quiet ripple of understanding laughter moved through the room again. "But I do know how to say this," I added. I took a breath. "Thank you for reminding me that my life didn't disappear just because I stopped looking at it." The words settled deeply, not just for them, but for me. Because I meant them, more than I had expected to. I lowered my gaze briefly, then looked back up. "And to the people who came forward tonight," I continued, my voice softer, now more personal. "I'm sorry, I didn't remember every detail." I paused. "But I remember enough to know that you were worth staying for." A few people in the audience shifted visibly emotional now. "And I'm glad that you're here." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then slowly I turned. Not toward the audience, not toward the man beside me, but toward the doorway. Toward them. Mark hadn't moved, but something in his posture had changed. He wasn't standing rigidly anymore. He looked smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Lisa's expression was harder to read, but her eyes, they weren't defensive anymore. They were searching, and Ethan was still watching me with that same quiet curiosity, like he was seeing someone new, someone he hadn't known before. I felt my chest tighten again, but this time, I didn't look away. For years, I had stepped back, given space, avoided confrontation, told myself it was easier that way. But standing here now, I realized something. Avoiding something doesn't make it disappear. It just delays the moment you have to face it. So I took a step forward. Just one, still on the stage, but closer to the edge, closer to them. Mark shifted slightly as if unsure whether to come forward or stay where he was. "Mom," he said. It was the first word he had spoken since he walked in, and it hit harder than everything else that had happened tonight, because of the way he said it, not casually, not distracted, but carefully, like he wasn't sure if he still had the right to say it. I swallowed. "Yes," I replied. The word felt different too, stronger, more grounded. He hesitated. "I didn't know," he said. Simple, direct, but filled with more weight than any explanation he could have given. "I know," I said, "because I did." That had been the truth all along. He took a small step forward. Lisa followed through more slowly. Ethan stayed close to them, his hand still resting against his father's sleeve. I thought Mark started, then stopped. His voice faltered slightly. "I thought you just worked a lot," he finished. I nodded slowly. "I did," I said. "But I didn't understand what that meant," he added. There it was. Not an excuse, not a defense, just a realization. That's fair, I said quietly. Because it was. Children don't always see the full picture. Sometimes they only see what's missing. Lisa finally spoke. We didn't know any of this. She said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, I didn't see judgment. I saw uncertainty, maybe even a little regret. I believe you, I said, and I did, because if they had known, tonight wouldn't have been a surprise. It wouldn't have been this moment of realization unfolding in front of everyone. Ethan stepped forward slightly, peeking around his father. Grandma, he said. The word caught me off guard. I blinked. Yes, his eyes were wide. Were you really a police officer? A small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. For a long time, I said. He looked impressed, like I had just told him something incredible. Did you catch bad guys? He asked. A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. I exhaled softly. Sometimes, I said. And you saved people, he added. I hesitated for a second. Then I nodded. Yes. His face lit up. That's cool. Simple. Honest. Unfiltered. And somehow that reaction meant just as much as everything else that had happened tonight. Maybe more. Because it wasn't about recognition, or ceremony, or acknowledgement. It was just, that's cool. Simple. Honest. Unfiltered. And somehow that reaction meant just as much as everything else that had happened tonight. Maybe more. Because it wasn't about recognition, or ceremony, or acknowledgement. It was just truth, seen clearly, without complication. I looked back at Mark, at Lisa, at Ethan, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like there was a wall between us. Not completely gone, but cracked, open, just enough. Maybe that was how things started, not with big apologies, not with dramatic changes, but with small moments of understanding. I didn't expect tonight to go like this. Maybe that was how things started, not with big apologies, not with dramatic changes, but with small moments of understanding. I didn't expect tonight to go like this, I said quietly. Mark let out a small breath. Neither did we. I nodded. I guess we all learned something, I added. He gave a faint, almost uncertain smile. Yeah, he said. We did. And for the first time since they walked into that room, I believed him. The room didn't rush past that moment. No one tried to fill the silence. No one tried to smooth it over or make it easier than it was. Because what stood between us and my family wasn't something that could be fixed, and my family wasn't something that could be fixed with a single sentence. It had taken years to build. Years of distance, years of assumptions, years of things left unsaid, and now it was all standing here with us. Visible, unavoidable, real. I stepped down from the stage slowly, the badge still in my hands. It felt strange walking toward them like this, not as the person who had been waiting at the dinner table earlier that night, not as the one who had been forgotten, but as someone they were only just beginning to understand. Each step felt deliberate, measured, like I was crossing more than just the distance between the stage and the doorway. Mark didn't move at first, neither did Lisa. But Ethan stepped forward a little more, his curiosity overcoming whatever hesitation the adults were holding on to. You really saved people? He asked again, his voice soft but clear. I smiled gently. I did my best, I said. He nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense to him, like doing your best was all that mattered. I wished for a moment that life had stayed that simple. Mark finally stepped forward. Not confidently, not like he had all the answers, but like someone who knew he needed to say something, even if he didn't know how. I should have been there, he said. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw it. Not just regret, but confusion. Because he wasn't just realizing what I had done. He was realizing what he had missed, and that's a harder thing to face. You didn't know, I said. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a dismissal. It was just the truth. That's not enough, he replied quickly. His voice tightened. I should have asked. I should have. He stopped himself. Because there was no way to finish that sentence. Not honestly. Not without admitting just how far the distance had grown. Lisa stepped forward beside him. We thought she started, then hesitated. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the stage, toward the people, toward the stories she had just heard. We thought you chose your job over everything else, she said finally. There it was, the assumption. The quiet narrative that had been shaping everything for years. I nodded slow, lie. I understand why you'd think that. We thought you chose your job over everything else, she said finally. There it was, the assumption. The quiet narrative that had been shaping everything for years. I nodded slowly. I understand why you'd think that, I said. Because I did. From the outside, it must have looked that way. Late nights, missed events, calls that pulled me away when I was supposed to stay. I didn't know how to explain it back then, I added. And then, eventually, I stopped trying. Mark's expression shifted. Why? He asked. The question felt simple, but the answer wasn't. Because every time I tried, I said, it felt like I was asking you to understand something you hadn't seen. I paused, and I didn't want to make you feel like you had to compete with it. The words surprised even me, because I hadn't said them out loud before. Not like this. Lisa frowned slightly. Compete with it. I nodded. With the job, with the people I helped, with the time I spent away. I explained. I didn't want you to feel like you were second to something you couldn't control. Mark let out a breath. But we already felt that way, he said. The honesty in his voice hit hard. Because there it was, the other side of the story, the part I had never fully understood. I know, I said quietly, and I did, now more than ever. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of realization, full of things finally being seen clearly. Not perfectly, but honestly. Ethan looked between us, sensing the shift, but not fully understanding it. Are you mad? He asked suddenly. The question caught all of us off guard. Mark glanced at me, then at Ethan. I don't think that's what this is, he said carefully. I looked at Ethan and smiled gently. No, I said. I'm not mad. And that was the truth, because anger would have been easier, cleaner, simpler. But what I felt wasn't anger. It was something more complicated, more human. I think we just didn't understand each other, I added. Ethan nodded as if that made sense. Like when Dad doesn't understand my homework, he asked. A small, unexpected laugh escaped me. Something like that, I said. Mark smiled faintly, though there was still something heavy behind it. I wish I had known, he said again. I studied him for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in my mind. If you had, would it have changed anything? He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to answer, but because he wanted to answer honestly. I don't know, he admitted, and that meant more than a perfect answer ever could, because it was real. Lisa nodded slightly. I think it would have made us ask different questions, she said. I considered that. Different questions. Not better, not perfect, just different. And maybe that was where everything had gone wrong. Not in what we said, but in what we never asked. I looked at the three of them, my family, still imperfect, still complicated, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened, but also standing here, present, trying. And that mattered, more than I had allowed myself to believe before. I can't change the past, I said. Mark nodded. I know, but we can decide what happens next, I added. Lisa looked at me, her expression softer now. What do you want that to be? She asked. The question hung in the air. Simple, but important. Hung in the air. Simple, but important. I took a slow breath, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't answer out of habit, or out of distance, or out of avoidance. I want us to start asking better questions, I said. Mark's expression shifted slightly. Like what? I took a slow breath, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't answer out of habit, or out of distance, or out of avoidance. I want us to start asking better questions, I said. Mark's expression shifted slightly, like what I smiled faintly. Like who we really are to each other, I replied. Ethan tilted his head. I know who you are, he said confidently. I looked at him. Who am I? I asked. He grinned. You're my grandma, he said. Then he paused. And you're a hero. The word landed softly, but it stayed. Not because it was grand, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple and true. In a way I had never allowed myself to accept before. I reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Thank you, I said. And this time, I knew exactly what I was thanking him for. Because sometimes, the clearest understanding comes from the simplest voice in the room. The ceremony didn't end immediately after that. No one rushed to leave. No one seemed eager to break whatever had just formed in that room. People began moving slowly, quietly, as if they didn't want to disturb something fragile. Daniel approached me again, but this time there was no distance between us. No stage, no spotlight, just two people standing face to face. You handled that better than I expected, he said with a faint smile. I let out a soft breath. I didn't expect any of this, I admitted. He nodded. That's kind of the point, he replied. I looked down briefly at the badge still in my hands. I spent years trying to forget parts of this life, I said, or at least trying to put them somewhere I didn't have to look at them every day. Daniel followed my gaze. And now? He asked. I hesitated. Now I don't think I was forgetting, I said slowly. I think I was protecting myself from what it meant. He studied me carefully. And what does it mean? He asked. I looked back up at him. It means I wasn't as alone as I thought, I said. He smiled slightly. No, he said, you weren't. We stood there for a moment, letting that settle. Then he added something I didn't expect. You know, he said, when I made that call, I wasn't sure you'd come. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You didn't sound unsure, I said. He chuckled quietly. That's because I needed you to say yes, he admitted. I nodded. I almost didn't. He paused. Why did you? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think I began, then stopped searching for the right words. I think part of me was still waiting, I said finally, for what he asked. For something to tell me it wasn't over, I replied. He nodded slowly. I'm glad you came, he said. I looked around the room again, at the people still talking in small groups, at the officers shaking hands with those who had come forward earlier, at my family. I looked around the room again, at the people still talking in small groups, at the officers shaking hands with those who had come forward earlier, at my family standing off to the side now not as distant as before, but not quite close either. So am I said. Daniel followed my gaze. They're trying, he said quietly. I know. That matters, he added. It does, I agreed. But there was something else I was still holding on to. Something that hadn't fully settled yet. I just don't know what happens next, I admitted. He smiled slightly. You don't have to, he said. You just have to be open to it. I let out a breath. That's not something I've been very good at. He shrugged lightly. Most people aren't, he said, until they have a reason to be. I glanced at him again. And this is my reason. He smiled. Part of it, he said. Before I could respond, Mark approached us, slowly, carefully, like he didn't want to interrupt but knew he needed to step in. Is this okay? He asked. Daniel looked at me. I nodded. Yes. Mark stepped closer, extending his hand toward Daniel. Thank you, he said. Daniel looked at his hand for a moment, then shook it. You don't need to thank me, he said. I do, Mark replied. You showed me something I should have seen a long time ago. Daniel held his gaze for a moment. Then don't let it stop here, he said. Mark nodded. I won't. Lisa joined them shortly after. Her posture was different now, less guarded, more thoughtful. I didn't realize how much we didn't know, she said, looking at me. I met her eyes. There's a lot I didn't say, I replied. She nodded. I think we're all starting to see that. Ethan tugged gently at my sleeve. Grandma, he said. Yes. Can I see it? He asked, pointing to the badge. I smiled and handed it to him carefully. He held it like it was something incredibly important, which in a way it was. It's heavy, he said. I laughed softly. It is. He looked up at me. Does that mean it's important? I paused for a second. Then I nodded. Yes, I said. It does. He seemed satisfied with that answer. Mark watched the exchange quietly. I don't think I ever saw it, he said. The badge? He nodded. You didn't, I replied. Why not? I thought about that for a moment. Because I left it behind, I said. He frowned slightly. Why would you do that? I looked at him. Because I thought it was over. Because I didn't think anyone needed to see it anymore. Because I didn't think it mattered. But I didn't say all of that. Instead, I gave him a simpler answer. Because I didn't think it belonged to my life anymore. He looked down briefly. Seems like it does, he said. I nodded. Yes, I agreed. It does. There was a quiet pause between us. Not uncomfortable, just real. I'm sorry, he said suddenly. The words came out quickly, like he had been holding them in for too long. I know it doesn't fix anything, he added, but I am. I studied him, and for the first time, I didn't question whether he meant it. I know, I said, and I did. Lisa placed a hand lightly on his arm. We both are, she added. I nodded. I believe you. Ethan looked between all of us. Does that mean everything's okay now? He asked. Mark smiled faintly. I think it means we're working on it, he said. Ethan considered that. Okay, he said. Simple, accepting, hopeful. And maybe that was enough for now. I looked at the three of them again, at the space between us that had started to close, even if only a little, at the possibility of something different, not perfect, not immediate, but real. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was standing outside of my own family. I felt like I was stepping back into it, carefully, slowly, but willingly. I turned back towards Daniel one last time. Thank you, I said again. This time not just for the ceremony, but for everything. He nodded. You already did the hard part, he said. I frowned slightly. What's that? He smiled. You showed up. I let that sink in, because maybe that had been the hardest part all along. And now I was here, still standing, still moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't doing it alone. The room slowly began to empty. Not all at once. People didn't rush out or break the moment with loud conversations. Instead, they moved carefully, as if they understood that something important had just happened and didn't want to disturb what remained of it. Officers came up to shake my hand. Some I recognized immediately. Others I didn't, but they all spoke the same way. With respect, with gratitude, with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that went deeper than words. You set the standard, one of them said. I learned from watching you, another added. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you, a younger officer said, smiling. That seemed to be the theme of the night. People remembering things I hadn't realized had stayed with them. After a while, the crowd thinned. The stage lights dimmed slightly. The energy shifted from ceremony to something more personal, more grounded. I found myself standing near the edge of the room, the badge still in my hand, though now it felt different. Less like something I had lost. More like something I had finally understood. Mark approached me again. This time, there was no hesitation in his steps. Are you ready to go? He asked. The question surprised me. Go? I repeated. Home, he said. The word landed softly. Home. It hadn't felt like a shared place in a long time. But the way he said it now, it sounded different, less like a location, more like an invitation. I looked at him for a moment, then at Lisa, then at Ethan, who was still holding on to the edge of my coat, like he didn't want to lose track of me again. I think I am, I said. Mark nodded. Good, he replied. We walked out together, not in silence, but not with forced conversation either, just together. The night air hit me as we stepped outside. Cool, fresh, real. For a second, I paused on the steps of the building, looking out at the city. Chicago had always felt like something I belonged to, but never fully shared. Tonight, it felt different. Do you still have that dinner? Ethan asked suddenly. I blinked. The dinner, I repeated. The one you made, he said. You said you cooked, right? I smiled faintly. I did. Is it still there? He asked. I thought about the kitchen, the table, the food I had packed away. Yes, I said. Then we should go eat it, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mark let out a quiet breath beside me. If that's okay, he added quickly. Lisa nodded. We'd like that, she said. There was something careful in her voice. Not performative, not polite. Just sincere. I looked at the three of them, and for the first time that night, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. Okay, I said, so we went. The drive felt different too. Not rushed, not distracted. No one was checking their phone every few seconds. No one was talking about work or schedules or things that didn't matter. We just drove. Together. When we pulled into my driveway, Mark turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. This place hasn't changed, he said. I smiled slightly. Neither have I replied. He looked at me. I think you have, he said. I shook my head gently. No, I said, you're just seeing it now. He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. We walked inside. The house felt exactly the way I had left it, quiet, still. The kitchen light cast it. Quiet, still. The kitchen light cast the same warm glow across the table. And there, sitting exactly where I had left it, was the cake. The candle had long since burned out, a thin trail of wax running down the side. Ethan walked straight toward it. You didn't eat it the same warm glow across the table. And there, sitting exactly where I had left it, was the cake. The candle had long since burned out, a thin trail of wax running down the side. Ethan walked straight toward it. You didn't eat it, he asked. No, I said. I was waiting. The words came out before I could stop them. But this time, they didn't feel heavy. They felt honest. Ethan looked at me, then at his father. Well, he said, we're here now. Mark let out a soft breath. Yeah, he said, we are. Lisa stepped into the kitchen, slowly looking around. I don't think I've ever really been in here, she admitted. I nodded. You haven't. She ran her hand lightly along the counter. It's nice, she said. Simple, but genuine. I moved toward the cabinet and took out plates. 4 this time. Not 3, not 1. 4. Mark noticed. His expression shifted slightly, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ethan helped me set the table. He didn't ask how. He just followed, watched, learned, like it mattered, like being there mattered. We sat down, all of us, at the same table, for the first time in I couldn't remember how long. The food wasn't perfect anymore. It had been sitting for hours, but no one complained. No one rushed. No one looked at the clock. We just ate and talked. Not about the ceremony, not about the past, but about small things, simple things. Ethan's school, Mark's work, but in a way that didn't feel like distance. Lisa's interests, and slowly, gently, the space between us began to feel less like a gap and more like something that could be filled. After dinner, Ethan looked at the cake again. You didn't blow out the candle, he said. I smiled. No, I replied. I didn't. He stood up quickly. Then we have to do it now. Mark chuckled softly. I think that's how it works, he said. Lisa nodded. Definitely, she added. Ethan grabbed a new candle from a drawer like he had always known where everything was. He placed it carefully in the center of the cake. Okay, he said. Now you can make a wish. I looked at the small flame as it flickered to life. For a moment, I didn't move, because earlier that night, that candle had meant something very different. It had felt like a symbol of everything I had lost, everything that hadn't shown up. But now it felt like something else, not an ending, but a beginning. What are you wishing for? Ethan asked. I smiled. I think I already got it, I said. And then I leaned forward and blew out the candle. The house was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that lingers after something meaningful has taken place. Mark and Lisa had stayed longer than I expected, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because they wanted to. We sat at the table even after the plates were cleared, talking. Not about the past in heavy, complicated ways, but about pieces of it, moments, memories, things we had each held on to differently. Ethan eventually fell asleep on the couch, his small frame curled up with a blanket, the faintest trace of a smile still on his face. Mark stood in the doorway for a moment watching him. I don't think I've ever seen him this calm, he said quietly. I smiled. He feels safe, I replied. Mark nodded slowly, then he turned back to me. I want him to know you, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a promise inside them, not just about Ethan, but about us. I'd like that, I said. Lisa stepped closer. I would too, she added. I looked at her. There was no tension in her voice now, no defensiveness, just honesty. I think we have a lot to learn, she said. I nodded. So do I, because this wasn't just about them understanding me. It was about me understanding them too. Understanding the years I had missed from their perspective. Understanding the ways my silence had shaped their assumptions. Understanding that healing doesn't come from one side, it comes from both. Mark glanced around the house again. I didn't realize how much of your life was still here, he said. I followed his gaze. The photographs, the small details, the pieces of a life that had continued quietly, even when no one was watching. I didn't realize it either, I admitted. He looked at me. What changed? He asked. I thought about that, about the ceremony, about the people who had stepped forward, about the stories I had finally seen from the other side. It didn't change, I said. I just stopped ignoring it. He nodded. As if that made more sense than anything else. After a while, they prepared to leave. Not abruptly, not awkwardly, just naturally. Mark picked up Ethan, carefully adjusting the blanket around him. Lisa grabbed her coat, pausing briefly near the door. Thank you, she said. Not for the dinner, not for the evening, but for something deeper. You're welcome, I replied. Mark lingered a second longer. I'll call you, he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. You better, I replied. He smiled faintly. I will. Then they left. The door closed softly behind them, and for a moment, I just stood there, listening. Not for what was missing, but for what remained. And what remained felt different. I walked back into the living room, sitting down slowly in the chair near the window. The badge was still in my hand. I hadn't put it down once. Not because I was afraid to, but because I didn't want to forget what it meant anymore. For years, I had defined my life by what I thought I had lost. The time, the connection, the closeness. I had told myself that those things were gone and that nothing could replace them. But tonight had shown me something I hadn't been willing to see. That life doesn't disappear just because it isn't recognized. That impact doesn't vanish just because it isn't acknowledged. That love, even when it's misunderstood, doesn't stop existing. It just waits. Waits for the moment it can be seen again. I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for a second. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel tired. I felt full, not because everything was fixed, not because everything was perfect, but because something had shifted, something real, something lasting. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not out of habit, but out of anticipation. I made coffee, opened the windows, let the light in. The house felt different, not bigger, not quieter, just warmer. My phone buzzed softly on the counter. I glanced at it. A message from Mark. I meant what I said. We're coming by this weekend. Ethan wants to hear more stories. I stared at the screen for a moment, then smiled. Not a big smile, not dramatic, just genuine. I typed back. It'll be ready. And for once, I knew I would be. For most of my life, I believed that being seen meant standing in the spotlight. That recognition had to be loud, public, undeniable. But what I learned, what it took me years to understand, is that the most important parts of our lives often happen quietly. In moments, no one applauds. In choices, no one records. In sacrifices that feel invisible. And sometimes those moments don't come back to us right away. Sometimes they take years to return. But when they do, they remind us of something powerful, that who we are is not defined by who notices us, but by what we choose to do, even when no one is watching. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever wondered whether what you did mattered, I hope this story reminds you that it does. Even if the recognition comes late, even if it comes in unexpected ways, even if it comes from places you never thought to look, because impact has a way of finding its way back. And when it does, it can change everything. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt forgotten only to be seen later in life? Share your story in the comments. And if this touched you in any way, don't forget to like and subscribe. You never know who might need to hear a story like this today.